This is Duke University.
Our next speaker will be Kalman, who's a professor emeritus of Duke's Department of Religious Studies. He's taught at Duke since 1973. He earned his undergraduate degree at Columbia, undergraduate and graduate degrees from the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, and a PhD in medieval Jewish and Islamic philosophy from Brandeis University. He specializes in medieval Jewish intellectual history. Among his publications is a monograph studying the history of Jewish aesthetics called The Artless Jew, Medieval and Modern Affirmations and Denials of the Visual. His current project focuses on the intersection of philosophy and animal fables in medieval Hebrew literature. This semester, as a research associate at the National Humanities Center, he is working on two texts: the 13th century Hebrew translation by Yaakov ben Elazar of Kalilah Vedimnah, a celebrated collection of Arabic fables, and the 14th century Hebrew rendition by Todros Todrosi of the major Arabic translation and commentary on Aristotle's Rhetoric. His talk is titled Animals as Humans, Kalilah Vedimnah.
If Kalilah and Dimnah had ever been biological creatures, they would have had big ears, long legs, and bushy tails. Their closest relatives would have been wolves, foxes, coyotes, and domestic dogs. Kalilah and Dimnah would have been jackals. But they were never biological. They've always been fictional. They are imaginary jackals, alive only in fables. Exactly like humans, they think, speak, and suffer. They ponder life while navigating its narrow margins for error. Kalilah is cautious and prudent. Dimnah, recklessly ambitious, is a troublemaker. They work as minor officials in a royal court, seething with the usual treachery, backstabbing, and bloody competition for power and status. Despite everything, they're loyal to one another. Their story is woven into the tragic tale of King Lion and Ox. Dimnah, refusing to heed Kalilah's warnings against meddling in royal affairs, introduces Ox to King Lion. Ox becomes King Lion's beloved companion. Dimnah's jealousy is provoked. Eventually, Ox meets a violent death. He is killed by King Lion in a duel arranged by the cunning Dimnah. Their story is the first in an anthology of animal fables that came to be called eponymously Kalilah and Dimnah, or Tales of Bidpai, Bidpai being the human sage who tells all the fables. The anthology is no thoroughbred. It is a medley, a hybrid, an amalgam, an entangled book, a fusion of heterogeneous cultures. Most of its stories originated in what became the Panchatantra, a book consisting of 5 chapters filled with animal fables composed in Sanskrit in India in roughly the 4th century of the Common Era. The fables were intended to impart worldly wisdom. They instructed kings, princes, and courtiers in the art of prudent statecraft. Some scholars consider the ideology of the fables to be Buddhist, others Hindu. Regardless of religious affiliation, at this early stage in their literary careers, the two jackals were known as Karataka and Damanika. The anthology also came to include at least 4 stories originating in another of the Sanskrit classics, 1 story from Book 11, and 3 fables from Book 12 of the Mahabharata. In the 6th century of the Common Era, the medley of Sanskrit fables was translated into Pahlavi, or Middle Persian, by Burzoi or Burzuya, a physician in the service of the Zoroastrian Sasanian court. Somewhat later in the 6th century, but still within the multi-ethnic Persian Empire, the Persian text became a convert. Its Indo-European identity was exchanged for Semitic. Bode or Bud, a Christian cleric, translated the Persian into Syriac. The Sanskrit Karataka and Damanika, who had become the Persian Karirak and Damanik, were now the Syriac Kalilah Vedimnah. The 6th century Syriac's translation still survives in research libraries and even on the internet. Burzuya's Persian text, the precursor to Bode's Syriac, is no longer extant, not even digitally. Only its reverberations and derivatives are knowable. Roughly 2 centuries later, in the mid-8th century of the Common Era, the Persian text ascribed to Burzuya was translated into Semitic again, this time into Arabic, by a controversial man of letters, a Zoroastrian or a Manichaean convert to Islam, Abdullah ibn Amukafa. In his hands, fabulous jackals still lived a fabled existence. They still behaved exactly like their human counterparts. But Syriac Kalilah and Dimnog evolved into the Arabophone Kalilah Vedimnah. The modification of their names was symptomatic of their lineage. Having come this far, having made it from India's Panchatantra and the Mahabharata by way of Persia to 8th century Baghdad, capital of the Abbasid Empire, the jackals and their eponymous anthology of fables were not finished with entanglement. They were designed to undergo constant change, some minor, some major. The inevitable consequence of addition and deletion, understandings and misunderstandings, all of them caused by endless migration to diverse lands and incessant scribal activity. Time also allowed for change to be fruitful and multiply. Roughly 500 years separate Ibn al-Mukafa's original Arabic from the date of the earliest extant Arabic version. One of the stories in Kalilah Vedimnah, whose provenance is neither Indian nor Persian, can be ascribed to Ibn al-Mukafa himself. It's the fable of a bird who worked hard at self-improvement without success. The bird ended up hobbled, having tangled its naturally mobile body into knots. Once upon a time, a crow saw a partridge walking, and he was intrigued by its gait and yearned to learn it. He took lessons, but was unable to master it. So he went back to his previous way of walking, but he had forgotten that, and he became perplexed and confused. Thus he attained neither what he had sought, nor yet did he perform well what he once possessed. For it has been said, he is reckoned ignorant who tried to control matters which do not suit him nor belong to his family, and which his fathers and ancestors before him neither attained nor knew. That's text number 1 on the handout. The story of the crow's predicament is an emblem of multiple entanglements: figurative, somatic entanglement of the traumatic kind, and literary entanglements of the cross-cultural, translinguistic kind. The penultimate provenance of the hobbled crow story is medieval and Christian. The immediate provenance is modern scholarship. An English translation of the medieval Castilian Kalilah Vedimnah, published in 1980 under the aegis of the Department of Languages and Literature at the University of Delaware. The translator, Thomas B. Irving, was conscientious. He checked his work against an early 20th century edition of a 14th century Arabic manuscript, but he relied mainly upon readings preserved in the two extant Spanish manuscripts, going back to Toledo and royal sponsorship in the late 13th century, when the translation into vernacular Castilian was made directly from Ibn al-Muqaffa's Arabic. The Iberian Reconquista version is therefore the final stop in an itinerary that began in Buddhist or Hindu Sanskrit, stopped for refreshment in Zoroastrian Pahlavi, refueled in Islamic Arabic, and finally headed west for the Castilian of Catholic Spain. The product of an even more entanglement is a later second Spanish translation. Like the first, its distant ancestors are the generations of Sanskrit, Pahlavi, and Arabic. The more immediate ancestors are Hebrew and Latin. Beginning with one of the earliest direct translations of Ibn al-Muqaffa's Arabic, the 12th century Hebrew version composed by an otherwise unknown Rabbi Joel. Later, in the middle of the 13th century, Rabbi Joel's Hebrew Kalilah Vedimnah was translated into the Latin Directorium Vitae Humanae by John of Capua, a convert from Judaism to Roman Catholicism. Texts are converted, translators are converts. Eventually, in later medieval and early modern Europe, John of Capua's Latin gave rise to the second Spanish translation. In turn, John of Capua's Latin begat additional offerings in Italian and French, and still more in German, with offshoots in Danish and Dutch. A second Hebrew translation in elegant rhyme prose, based directly on the Arabic original, was composed at the end of the 12th or beginning of the 13th century by Jacob ben Elazar in Toledo, Spain. The first English translation, based directly on an Italian version of John of Capua's Latin, first appeared in 1570. As if all this complexity were not sufficiently charming, the entanglements of cultural transmission become even more finely grained and even more irresistible when the tale of the hobbled crow is compared to the story of the hapless raven. It is narrated in the Alphabeta de Ben Sira, the alphabet or tales of Ben Sira, a Hebrew text composed in 9th or 10th century Baghdad, multicultural capital of the Abbasid Empire, a dazzling time and place in which Ibn al-Muqaffa's Kalilah Vedimnah circulated widely, both in writing and in oral performance. What follows then, mediated in my 21st century English, is the 10th century rabbinic Hebrew echo of Ibn al-Muqaffa's Arabic. Text number 2 on the handout. Why does the raven walk unsteadily? Once the raven saw the dove walking gracefully with a step lovelier than any other bird. Since the dove's step pleased him, he said to himself, I will walk just like her. But while he nearly broke himself in two trying to learn to walk like the dove, the other birds made fun of him. Embarrassed, the raven said, "I'll go back to my original step." But when he tried to return to it, he could not. He had forgotten the way he used to walk. The raven wobbled. He could not walk in his original step or in the new one. The proverb says about him, "He who seeks more than he has will be left with less." The raven was left with nothing. Instead of Reconquista, crow, and partridge, we encounter rabbinic raven and dove. The difference is negligible. No matter the bird, whether Iberian Catholic or Baghdadian Jewish, the predicament of thwarted locomotion is identical. Given that identity, we can fairly conclude that we have two versions of one and the same story. Not to be underestimated, however, are several differences. Unlike the rabbinic Baghdadian version, the Reconquista story mentions nothing of the other birds who made fun and nothing of the embarrassment caused by their avian ridicule. The upshots also differ. Unlike the rabbinic Baghdadian version, whose concluding proverb repeats the cliché, the standard scold against appetite for material gain, "He who seeks more will be left with less," the lesson drawn by the Spanish Reconquista parallel is archly conservative. It reviles attraction to the foreign and condemns deviation from ancestral practice. Quote, "He is reckoned ignorant who seeks to acquire that which his fathers and ancestors before him neither attained nor knew." The stories are also embedded differently. The literary framework of the rabbinic Baghdadian alphabet of Ben Sira is quiz show. The tale of the raven and dove belongs to a series of ideological inquiries in which the sage Ben Sira provides mythological or theological answers to a battery of burlesque, quasi-scientific questions raised by King Nebuchadnezzar, such as, quote, "Why were farts created? Why has God created in his world wasps and spiders, which only cause harm and do nothing beneficial? Why does the ox not have hair underneath its nose? Why does the cat eat the mouse rather than other rodents? Why are the cat and dog enemies? Why does the dog acknowledge its master while the cat does not? Why does the raven walk unsteadily? And why does the raven copulate by mouth?" The Reconquista version is framed differently. Being a direct translation of the Arabic, it transmits the entirety of a chapter in Ibn al-Muqaffa's Kalilah Vedimnah. In printed editions of the Arabic, the chapter is entitled "The Pious Devotee," or hermit or ascetic, Nasik, and "The Guest," the Daif. As it unfolds in a 13th century Arabic manuscript, published in Cairo in 1941, with an introduction by the famous Egyptian Taha Hussein, the story goes like this. After enjoying a serving of dates provided by the devotee, or the ascetic, or the hermit, the guest laments, presumably in Arabic, the absence of that delicious fruit in his native land. The devotee, presumably in Arabic, chides the guest for not being satisfied with his homeland commodities. The guest subsequently overhears the devotee speaking Hebrew. Infatuated with the language, the guest implores the devotee to teach him to speak it. The devotee refuses. He chastises and dissuades the guest by invoking the story of a pathetic crow. "How was that?" asked the guest. and the reply will sound familiar. It is told, said the devotee, that a crow saw a partridge walking, taking its steps. Its gait aroused his admiration, and he craved to learn it. He practiced and trained himself, but was unable to master its requirements. So he reverted to his former way of walking, but was unable to be proficient. He remained confused and forsaken. And the Arabic here is the same root in Arabic that's used for people who stammer and for people who commit apostasy, falling off of your traditional ancestral religion. Forsaken, incapable of attaining what he sought, and not fit to recover what he once possessed. And this story was enough to convince the guest to give up the hope of learning this foreign language, Hebrew. This Arabic narrative, exactly like its many rebirths in numerous medieval and early modern translations, presents a practical lesson in life. Its subject is the peril of desire. It portrays models of human behavior to emulate or avoid. The rabbinic story of the hobbled bird, by contrast, displays very little interest in human conduct. Its agenda is cosmological rather than ethical. Accordingly, it extracted the nugget from Ibn al-Muqaffa's text, eliminates the exchange between devotee and guest, featured in the Arabic Kalilah Vedimnah, and preserved in all of the other translations. These discrepancies are unmistakable. The stories of the hobbled bird clash on literary format, cast of characters, and moral lesson. Awareness of their divergence reinforces our recognition of discrete Sanskrit and Pahlavi threads woven into the complex fabric of Ibn al-Muqaffa's Kalilah Vedimnah, out of which the raw material was taken for making the patchwork quilt of its many medieval and early modern derivatives. With all of these particularities in mind, it may be more reasonable to conclude that we have encountered multiple and distinct stories, not one and the same story with different versions. On second thought, despite everything, it may indeed be one and the same story, counteracting all the multiplicity, all the plasticity of form and meaning, all of the centrifugal adaptability to endless transcultural dislocation. There does appear to be a single, stabilizing, decisive, centripetal constant. In each case, regardless of language and diachronic particularity, the story is always an animal fable. In this literary genre, the entanglement of bodies and identities is so comprehensive that otherwise noticeable differences between human and non-human bodies and behavior dissolve, disappear. Unless we already knew the truth, would we have guessed that characters who ridicule and embarrass another character, who is trying to change a habitual mode of behavior and gives up feeling confused and forsaken, are birds rather than human beings? The single centripetal constant is tempting but deceptive. The valence of an animal fable is no less multiplex and entangled than the assertion that Hebrew is too difficult a language to learn. The reference to Hebrew cannot have meant to the Islamic and Arabophone audience of Ibn al-Muqaffa's 8th century Baghdad what it meant to the Jewish audience of Rabbi Joel's 12th century Hebrew translation, and so on for the ecclesiastically educated Christians, late medieval audience of John of Capua's Latin, and for all the other diverse medieval, early modern, and modern audiences attending to the many versions of Kalilah Vedimnah. To some of these audiences, Hebrew aroused antipathy or served proverbially as the language too hard to learn. Equally contingent on local presuppositions would have been an explanation for the devotees' Hebrew. The animals diverge in significance, that animal fables diverge in significance, depending on the intellectual, religious, and socio-political profile of their audience, is not mere conjecture. In some cultures, animal fables, if taken literally, are heterodox and subversive. They demand suspension of disbelief. They require an acrobatic hermeneutics that defends rhetoric, clarifies the mechanisms of simile, metaphor, and allegory. In other cultures, no such exertions are necessary. Animal fables would not be figures of speech that need to be taken with grains of hermeneutic salt. They are perfectly seasoned just as they are. Where fables are orthodox and normative, they are self-evident. I come to the end soon. A vivid case in point is Lion and Jackal, another chapter in Kalilah Vedimnah. The story originated in the Mahabharata, describing a king Paurika, who was, quote, the worst of beings, exceedingly cruel. He took delight in injuring others. Stained by the evil of his human acts, he was reborn as a jackal. Remembering his former prosperity, he became filled with grief and abstained from meat and became compassionate to all creatures, truthful in speech, and firm in the observance of his vows. When this Sanskrit story was made Persian by the Zoroastrian Burzuya, and then for the first time made Syriac by Bud, the Christian cleric, the biographical details of the jackal's rebirth, transmigration, or reincarnation were faithfully preserved. Not so in the second Syriac translation, based directly on Ibn al-Muqaffa's Arabic. Not in any of the extant Arabic manuscripts of Ibn al-Muqaffa, Kalilah Vedimnah, and not in any of the medieval or early modern translations of the Arabic text. In all of them, the story of transmigration was disfigured and then subjected to cosmetic surgery. The unfamiliar, irritating, heterodox, or heretical facticity of transmigration was censored out of existence. The erasure created a narrative vacuum that was filled with ingenious suggestions for the jackal's otherwise unintelligible vegetarianism, compassion for all sentient creatures. In societies where transmigration was taken for granted, the story of the lion and the jackal meant one thing. Where that sort of entanglement between human and non-human bodies was unknown or unacceptable, the story meant something different. Now really to conclude. With the help of a hobbled bird in Kalilah Vedimnah, a case can be made that we have encountered one and the same story with many variations. An equally reasonable case can be made that we have encountered as many distinctive stories as there are variations. No need to be partisan, don't have to choose sides. No need to decide between the options, both of the above. One in many, whether entangled or in tandem, is the most compelling and productive answer. In that spirit, the tale of the devotee and the guest deserves a second look. The first look was scornful of the overreaching guest and filled with admiration for the devotee. But if virtue consists in rejecting the foreign, the devotee was no paragon. He failed to reject the foreign. If Hebrew was his native language, he set a bad example in having learned the language of his guest. And if the devotee and his guest spoke the same non-Hebraic ancestral speech, the devotee was wrong in having learned Hebrew. The disjunction between what the devotee preaches and what he practices artfully invites us to turn the story on its head. I suspect that the disjunction was deliberate. It signals satire, a judicious method for deflating chauvinism and mocking the conservatives. I suspect that the authors of the story were siding with the heroic guest and repudiating the obnoxious behavior manifested by the ethnocentric birds who ridicule and hypocritical devotees who pontificate. The authors of the story may have been cosmopolitans like Burzuya, who reports having been enlightened in India and alienated from all religions, or Ibn al-Muqaffa himself, who was aware that the Persian precursor to his Arabic Kalilah Vedimnah originated in Sanskrit. A Burzuya would have known that learning Sanskrit does not interfere with maintaining mastery of Persian, just as al-Muqaffa knew that his Persian neither interfered with nor suffered corruption from his learning Arabic. Whoever they are, the authors of the fable would rejoice in Walter Benjamin's acknowledgement, quote, that our translations, even the best ones, proceed from a wrong premise. They want to turn Hindi, Greek, and English into German, instead of turning German into Hindi, Greek. Accordingly, the authors of our fable would happily insist that Burzuya taught Persian to think in Sanskrit, that al-Muqaffa taught Arabic to think in a Persian-inflected Sanskrit, that Rabbi Joel and Jacob ben Elazar taught Hebrew to think in an Arabic-inflected Persian and Sanskrit, and that John of Capua taught ecclesiastical Latin to think in a Hebrew-inflected Arabic, Persian, and Sanskrit, and so on for all of the translations and derivatives. Studying these rebirths is what we humanists are well equipped to do. Studying these rebirths humanistically is a proper answer to Edward Said's challenge. Quote, the real question is whether in the end we want to work for civilizations that are separate, or whether we should be taking the more integrative, but perhaps much more difficult path, which is to see them as making one vast whole, whose exact contours are impossible for any one person to grasp, but whose certain existence we can intuit and feel.
And I had a couple questions, actually just one comment, but a couple questions. And the two questions were, first, were the people who made all these transitions and translations aware of their own genealogy, aware of the fact that it went back, and were there evidences of the traces? We saw footsteps, of God, as it were, in the first presentation. But I was wondering if there were any traces or footstep-like elements in this whole tradition. And the second question that goes with that, was there any sense, oh, we got it right, and these others, or in other words, were there commentaries? Were there commentary, not just translations, but commentaries? And my final statement, which is a commentary, is not only do the translations move, but so do the translators convert. Is your first guy, T.J. Irving, became Hajj Ali Abu Nasr al-Ta'lim. He became a Muslim. So just to ask you.
Yeah, actually, the translators were aware of the genealogy of the text, and it lent to the text a charm and an attraction that even ordinary collection of fables wouldn't have had. Ibn al-Muqaffa probably himself wrote backstories to introduce the collection of fables. He told the story of how Burzuya was commissioned to go to India to collect the tales, and he translated them from Sanskrit into Persian. And then he also tells the story of how Burzuya's text was translated into Arabic by Ibn al-Muqaffa. And many of the stories are given geographical settings. Like this story came from India. It happened in India that such and such an animal did such and such a thing. So in the Hebrew version, the 13th century Hebrew version of Kalilah Vedimnah, when Jacob ben Elazar is translating Ibn al-Muqaffa's introductory chapters, there's a wonderful Hebrew rendition of the Arabic too, saying, these books written by the Indians are the sages of India. Since they didn't have revelation by God with prophets and seers, their wise men collected all of this prudential wisdom to teach the people. And these fables are the Torah of the Indians. Yeah. So, yeah. I don't know if they knew that it was, I don't think they knew that it was the Mahabharata or that it was the Panchatantra. But they knew that it was coming from India, and that carried with it a valence of Oriental wisdom. And for many of the people that I've been reading of and studying, part of the appeal of these fables and their truth was that they were out of the Abrahamic trialogue. It was evidence of a universal ethic. You can imagine a society in which we didn't have Jews, Christians, and Muslims, but we only had universal human beings. And the stories of animal fables dissolving the difference between humans and animals is sort of a model for dissolving the differences between cultures. And I think that's one of the appeals of this entanglement of the text. They were always very careful to give the genealogy.
In these stories, at least the first two, the moral is different, has a different perspective and a different notion. The first one is more about remain true to your past. The other one, don't try to be different. All right. Why is there no moral at the end? And the question becomes, which is more important, the moral or the story that is attached to each other? This is just purely speculation, I'm not asking.
The third story is as literal a translation as I can give you of Ibn al-Muqaffa's Arabic. And there is no moral attached to it because it's embedded in the story of the devotee and the guest. So the moral of the story is, don't try to learn Hebrew as a language. It's going to screw you up. You're going to lose your original language and you can't learn Hebrew either. That's the punchline of the story. One of the virtues of fable literature is that the stories, the narratives, are very tolerant. They'll take any number of what the scholars call epimythia. After the fable is told, it tells you what the punchline should be. You'll find the same myth or fable in Aesop in Greek, or in Avianus in Latin, or in Marie de France in 13th century collections, or Jean La Fontaine in 17th century France. They tell exactly the same story, but the morals that they attach to it are altogether different.
So is it a matter of audience that they're reaching?
Matter of audience and matter of the author's own sensibilities, how they want to put the story to use. So that's why there are ellipses in the third translation, the 3 dots. It's part of the conversation between the devotee and the guest.
So I've read around a little bit in scholarship on Aesop's fables. And so maybe the people I was reading are wrong, but they said that there's often in such fables a note of kind of social criticism and ridicule and satire. But these fables, at least the first 2, seem to be kind of reinforcing traditional norms rather than questioning them. So I don't know, are the scholars about Aesop that I was reading wrong, or what?
let's think about the third story, the Arabic one of Ibn al-Muqaffa. And if we put it into the context of Abbasid Islamic world, where we know that there were debates about which language is the true language, the best of all, do all Muslims have to learn Arabic? How about Persian culture and literature? Is Persian going to be a worthy equivalent to Arabic? And there were movements of different ethnic groups making a claim that their languages are as good as Arabic. And the people chose up sides. I imagine that Ibn al-Muqaffa's fable had something to do with the arguments in the Abbasid Empire about, does everybody have to know Arabic, or are different languages equivalent with one another? And this story is a critique of people who say only Arabic, and that if you try learning another language, you're making a mistake, you're going to lose everything. I think it's a plea for tolerance and opening up the culture to a variety of languages. I'm not sure that that's so in the Spanish translation, and the Hebrew rabbinic version of the tale isn't interested in those questions at all. It may be a parody of Talmudic literature. When you ask a clever question and see if you can elicit a clever answer, it doesn't care about a social reality of, should we learn other people's languages? Are they even learnable? But the third, I think Ibn al-Muqaffa's original Arabic version had exactly in mind the issue of learning language. Why he chose Hebrew, to me, is very interesting. There was a whole bunch of languages he could have named, but Hebrew was the one that attracted the guests' attention. And that, to me, is quite fascinating. David?
I think I'm trying to get at the tension between some of the, I don't want to quite call it universalism, but some of the commonness that you're pointing towards, that the text opens up, and the fact that the story itself tells about some kind of limit, or draws an edge, in that the crow is, has this kind of stumble to it in the story. And I don't see those as being unrelated. I'm not trying to say there's a contradiction. I just wondered about your thought about that.
Well, I said yes to both of the above. I think it's one story with many versions, or it's as many different stories as there are versions, and they're both simultaneously true.
So what is the position of ethics with respect to that? Isn't there, I mean, what is the relationship of that idea to an ethic, which would be the moral, maybe?
In Ibn al-Muqaffa's backstory of how Burzuya went to India to learn, Burzuya is an archetypal free thinker. There are books about the tradition of free thinking in Islam. So from other things that we know about Ibn al-Muqaffa, it looks like he was projecting onto Burzuya his own disaffection from religion. Burzuya makes this speech saying, I'd like to know what the truth about life is, how I should conduct myself. What religion should I follow? So I'm going to do with religion what I did with learning medicine. I'm going to ask the experts. But when I ask the experts in religion, all I hear from them is my religion is right and everybody else's is wrong. And that persuades me that none of them are right. I'm just going to live a good life. I'm going to be a good doctor to as many people as I can. I'm not going to charge extortionate fees. I'm just going to be a good person, and the hell with all of your religions. Pox on them all. Yes.
It seems like a wonderful fable of the complexity of the Indo-European I think also of the legend of Europa's Ride and the crossing of the Mediterranean into other spaces. And it's a wonderful reflection about the humanities and what the humanities can do at a moment where whole regions of the world are being cast as one static thing that, and it couldn't be more sort of flowing and translational. And I think it was a wonderful paper.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.